Welcome back, Dr. Kruse. Go ahead and have a seat, and I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Kruse, before we broke for lunch, I think you had told us that you made a determination at the time of the autopsy that the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was homicide, and that's where I want to pick us back up. What are the possible manner of death findings that a forensic pathologist can make?
There are 5 options in terms of manner of death. The most common option is natural, so that's death due purely to natural disease. There's suicide, death at the hands of oneself. There's accident, death due to a hostile environment or unforeseen circumstances. There's homicide, death at the hands of another, and undetermined, which is used when you have all the information available and cannot choose one of the other manners, or you have compelling information for 2 competing manners.
And for a forensic pathologist to make a manner of death finding that a death is a homicide, what is the level of proof that a forensic pathologist needs to have?
There's no exact determination. It uses our medical judgment. I set a very high standard for myself, and often in court it's termed as to a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Well, isn't there a standard that to make a finding that a death is a homicide, that a forensic pathologist needs to have clear and convincing evidence that that death was a homicide?
I would put that with a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Clear and convincing evidence is vague. It's really up to the pathologist.
To make that finding, well, let me ask you this. Do you disagree that the appropriate standard is clear and convincing evidence?
I find it to be vague, but if that's what other people are comfortable with, I don't have huge issues with it.
Is that the standard in your profession, clear and convincing evidence?
By whom?
By what the generally accepted practices are in forensic pathology.
I need more information on who's making that general principle.
Is there any general acceptance in the field of forensic pathology about what the level of proof a forensic pathologist needs to have to find that a death was a homicide?
The National Association of Medical Examiners gives guidelines for manners of death. Manner of death can be complicated, and different circumstances require different determinations. So clear and convincing evidence, I would really need more information as to what that means to you or another person in a certain scenario.
And I understand, but my question is, Dr. Kruse, not what you understand, but what the generally accepted practices in forensic pathology?
I guess I'm not an expert in terms of who you think everyone is in terms of generally accepted practices.
So that's not a question you're able to answer?
I see what you're getting at, but I've seen that term in the same way I've seen reasonable degree of medical certainty. Sure, I do agree, but I haven't polled every medical examiner to see if that's generally accepted by everybody.
So am I right then that you don't know what the generally accepted standard is in your field for making a determination of homicide?
I would argue that no one knows what everybody thinks within my field.
And you understand that I'm not asking you what everyone thinks. I'm asking you what's generally accepted.
Well, I would have to see where that came from for you to tell me that. I've seen that many, many times, generally accepted practices or in terms of how much evidence you need, how much medical certainty you need. So, sure, I'll agree with you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Kruse. Was there any evidence at the time of autopsy that Ms. Mullis died by suicide?
No.
Was there any evidence that her death was a natural death?
No.
Am I right that that left you 3 options for manners of death then?
Yes.
And that left you with it being undetermined, an accident, or homicide?
I suppose.
Well, did you have some other possible finding that was available to you besides those 3 once you'd ruled out natural and suicide?
I think it suggests that I considered accident, which was not the manner of death.
Mike, and I appreciate that, but once you had decided it wasn't a suicide and it wasn't natural, we have 3 other possible options left, understanding you picked one of the 3.
Correct, but I'd like to be sure that that doesn't indicate that was my natural order of thought.
Well, understood, and I think that's what we're talking about here today. At the time of autopsy, what was your understanding of the number of times that the corn rake that was at issue in this case had?
It had 4.
And at the time of autopsy, how many penetrating injuries did you determine that Ms. Mullis had in her back?
6.
Did you focus your autopsy analysis ultimately on the cause of those 6 penetrating injuries in her back?
Could you restate that? I'm sorry.
Sure. I mean, was it your determination at autopsy that those that the area where those 6 penetrating injuries were in her back, that those injuries were the cause of her death?
Yes, those injuries were the cause of her death.
So that's the area of her body you were focused on ultimately in making your determination about what the cause and manner of her death were?
Sure.
I want to, and I think you said this to us a second ago, that that at the time of your 2023 deposition in this case, and let me ask you first if you recall being deposed in 2023.
Yes.
At the time of your 2023 deposition in this case, what was your understanding of why Ms. Mullis's death could not have been an accident?
Could you define what I mean, my understanding, or how I came to that determination?
Well, let me ask you this. At the time of your deposition in 2023, why did you determine that Ms. Mullis's death could not have been an accident?
My determination of why it wasn't an accident goes back to 2018 and has remained the same throughout, so I can explain that determination if you'd like.
Please do.
So an accident, as it was initially suggested, would say that Ms. Mullis fell on the corn rake. There hasn't been, as far as I know, any argument to the contrary in terms of the corn rake causing her injuries. I conceded at the deposition, and I believe it to be reasonable, that a person could potentially fall on a sharp object, such as the corn rake, once. To think, as a medical doctor, that someone could fall on something backwards, be impaled entirely through their torso, pull that object out through the back of them, then fall on it again, pull it out, and potentially fall on it a third time, which I think seems reasonable, is way outside any degree of medical certainty. There are a number of different injuries that could potentially support a fall, such as blunt force injuries to the posterior surfaces of Ms. Mullis's body, say to the back of her head, her shoulders, her hips, her buttocks, even to her elbows, things that I would see in someone who has fallen, as I have seen many deaths due to falls. None of them were there. So it's lack of supporting evidence for an accident, and also the thought that she could fall on the rake, pull it out, fall on it again, is entirely impossible from a medical standpoint. I also did reason in her additional injuries. She had a number of additional injuries to the anterior surfaces of her body. So to suggest that she fell backward, then somehow sustained injuries to the front surfaces of her bodies, then maybe falling forward, is entirely impossible.
Well, the most compelling finding for you that led you to conclude that this was not an accident was that, and I say this with respect to Ms. Mullis, but I don't really know another way to say it, that there were more holes in her back than there were tines in the rake. Isn't it true that that was the most compelling finding for you that led you to conclude that it was not an accident?
Yes.
And from the testimony you just provided, at the time that you determined that this was a homicide back at the autopsy in 2018, could you envision any way that Ms. Mullis could have fallen on this rake more than once and caused her injuries?
No.
How long did your autopsy of Ms. Mullis take?
I don't recall entirely. I know I had stated in my prior depositions and testimonies about 3 hours.
That is a pretty standard time for you in terms of how long an autopsy would take?
I perform more than one autopsy at a time, so it really depends on the type of cases I have that day. It simply depends.
When you say that you're doing more than one autopsy at once, you have more than one body in the autopsy suite that you're looking at the same time? Is that what you mean by that?
Yes.
In your prior testimony in this case, did you say that your autopsy of Ms. Mullis took between 2 and 3 hours?
I'd have to go back and look, but I think that's a reasonable statement.
Well, if I represented to you that that was your prior testimony, do you have any reason to think that's wrong?
No.
And you said that you do more than one autopsy. Let me start that question again. Back in 2018, you said that you would do more than one autopsy at a time.
Yes.
Does that mean that during the 2 to 3 hours that you would have been looking at Ms. Mullis's body, that you weren't spending that entire time looking at her body?
No, I wouldn't be standing there the entire time.
And that's because you'd be looking, is that because you'd be looking at more than one body over that time period?
It would be a mixture of me looking at other bodies, and I have an autopsy technician who assists me with the autopsy process. There are components to the autopsy that they do alone, and I don't need to be there.
In that process where you are looking at more than one body at once, is your attention divided between different cases and different bodies?
Yes.
Do you know how many different bodies you were looking at during the 2 to 3 hours that you did the autopsy for Ms. Mullis?
I do not recall, no.
Was it more than 4?
No.
Was it more than 3?
It should not have been more than 3 at that period of time. We did no more than 3 in one day.
I do want to talk to you about the information that you had at autopsy. At the time that you conducted the autopsy of Ms. Mullis back in 2018, the time at which, as you've testified, you determined that her cause of death was, or that the manner of her death was a homicide. Did you have a short conversation with Dr. Craig Thompson before you conducted that autopsy?
I did.
And Dr. Craig Thompson was a medical doctor, is that correct?
Yes.
Was he a forensic pathologist?
No.
Was he someone who had your same level of qualifications to evaluate injuries?
You'd have to ask Dr. Thompson. I'm actually not quite too sure what type of a doctor he is.
But you understood, at the time you talked to Dr. Thompson, you knew that he was, did you know that he was not a forensic pathologist?
Yes.
And do you, at the time that you talked to Dr. Thompson, did you consider that you, as a forensic pathologist, had more expertise in determining the cause and manner of death than a person who was not a forensic pathologist?
Yes.
At the time you talked to Dr. Thompson, did he tell you whether he had any concerns about the circumstances of Ms. Mullis's death?
He told me, as I recall, that he had concerns about her injuries being non-accidental in nature.
And were those concerns that you as a forensic pathologist took with a grain of salt, since he was not a forensic pathologist?
I accepted them. I wasn't dismissive, I think, which is what that suggests. I heard them and said, I will see what I see at autopsy.
When you went, is it true then that when you went into the autopsy, for Ms. Mullis that you had already received information that there was someone who had concerns about her death?
As we established, Dr. Thompson told me he had concerns.
So is it true then that you started with the thought in your mind that there was something concerning about Ms. Mullis's death?
I had heard that someone else had concerns, yes, but I had not seen her yet.
Well, it was your testimony that you weren't dismissive of that. Is that right?
Correct.
So you were considering that.
Right. I didn't hear it and then forget it. I remembered it and did the autopsy.
Did you hear any information before you went to conduct the autopsy that Ms. Mullis's death was an accident?
Yes.
And where did you hear that from?
That came from Dr. Thompson, who said that, I believe, as I recall, that he was told that she fell on it, but he had concerns about her injuries. We also receive intake phone calls, and to the best of my recollection, that was part of our intake phone call, that she may have fallen on the rake.
That was was it Dr. Thompson who was reporting that to you?
Most likely.
And what you heard from, is it true that what you heard from Dr. Thompson was that he was concerned that it was reported that she fell, but he was seeing injuries that he found concerning in that context?
He thought her injuries seemed inconsistent with a fall.
After talking with Dr. Thompson, well, let me ask you this. Did you take any other information about Ms. Mullis's death into your autopsy other than your conversation with Dr. Thompson?
Their law enforcement attended the autopsy. I can't remember exactly what information I was provided, but I'm open to really any information before I perform my autopsy. I consider myself unbiased regardless of what I hear.
As to what you just said about considering yourself to be unbiased, do you consider at the time you start an autopsy that information that you hear could give you implicit bias?
Could you be more specific?
Well, have you ever heard the term implicit bias before?
I have, and actually only in legal settings, and each time I say, can you be more specific, and
Well,
tell me what you mean by it.
Do you have an understanding of what that term means to you?
I think I do, but I actually worry maybe it is incorrect, so you could tell me, that would be great.
Well, I'm not allowed to answer questions from you. I'm sorry. I'm asking you questions. So I'm asking you what your understanding of the term implicit bias is.
I suppose I don't have a strong understanding of it.
Okay. Do you, well, let me come back to that. I want to ask you this. You said that you were open to hearing, and I don't want to misstate your testimony, is it your testimony that you were open to hearing information about a case before you began an autopsy? I just want to make sure I understood your testimony about that, so I apologize if I've misstated it.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Sure. I want to make sure I didn't misstate your prior testimony. Was it your testimony that you were open to hearing additional information related to an autopsy that you conducted?
Yes.
And why were you open to hearing additional information related to an autopsy that you conducted?
Investigative information can be helpful. I do not perform an autopsy in a vacuum, and I think I possess the capabilities to take each bit of information individually and use it if it's appropriate.
When you began Ms. Mullis's autopsy, the information you had about her death came from your short phone call with Dr. Craig Thompson. Is that right?
Most of the information I had was from Dr. Thompson. He's the investigating medical examiner.
And you said most of the information. At the time that you started the autopsy, what information did you have about Ms. Mullis's death that did not come from Dr. Craig Thompson?
Travis Hemosath was there. I don't remember if he provided any extra information. Essentially the information is Ms. Mullis was purported to have fallen on the corn rake, and then Dr. Thompson said that he was concerned that her injuries did not match a fall on a corn rake.
Did you talk with Deputy Hemesath before you began Ms. Mullis's autopsy?
Yes.
How long did you talk to him for before you began the autopsy?
I do not recall.
Did you have information from any other source before you began the autopsy other than your conversation with Dr. Thompson and your conversation with Deputy Hemesath?
Not that I can recall at this time.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Deputy Hemesath was in the autopsy of Ms. Mullis with you.
Yes.
Was anyone else in the autopsy with you besides your assistant and Deputy Hemesath and you?
I don't recall. Sometimes I can have law enforcement on multiple cases. I can't say confidently whether or not other people were in the room. There are multiple autopsy technicians as well when I'm doing multiple cases, but no one else relating to the case.
Well, and you said that you have more than one autopsy going on at a time. Is it possible that while you were conducting Ms. Mullis's autopsy, that there were actually other law enforcement officers not even related to this investigation that were also there for the autopsy while you were doing this one?
They would be there for a different autopsy and not involved in Ms. Mullis's autopsy.
Well, they're standing in that situation. Are they standing in the same room with you?
They're standing in the same autopsy suite potentially. We have different areas for people to stand, different stations for the autopsy. They're separated in that manner. They could also be looking through a window. I simply don't remember. But I do remember that the only person I spoke to from a law enforcement standpoint during the autopsy was Travis Hemesath.
You have a clear, is it true that you have a clear memory as you sit here today of only speaking to Deputy Hemesath during this deposition and no one else? Or during this autopsy and no one else?
During the autopsy itself?
Yes.
Other people would be within my office, potentially. We have an investigator on the case, the autopsy technician. I don't recall speaking to anyone else about Ms. Mullis during the autopsy, no.
And the autopsy suite that you're describing, is it an open room with more than one table in it for where the bodies sit for the autopsy?
It's fairly open, yes, and there are multiple tables.
How far apart are the tables?
I don't know.
Are they further apart than 3 feet?
Yes?
Are they further apart than 10 feet?
I'm not entirely sure. You'd have to ask somebody with a tape measure to go and measure them.
Was Deputy Hemesath standing near Ms. Mullis's, where Ms. Mullis's body was during the autopsy?
As far as I recall, yes.
Is it correct that he wasn't looking through glass?
Correct.
To make sure that I understand the order of what occurred, am I correct that you had information from Dr. Thompson, you spoke briefly with Deputy Hemesath before this autopsy, you talked with Deputy Hemesath during this autopsy, and then at the conclusion of this autopsy, you made your findings?
Yes.
There is no requirement that let me ask you the question this way. Is there any requirement that at the conclusion of an autopsy, you as a forensic pathologist have to make your cause and manner of death determination right then?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
It's true that there's absolutely no requirement that that occur. Is that right?
Not that I'm aware of.
And it's your testimony that you are open to more information related to a case. Is that right?
Always.
In this particular case, did you seek any other information between the end of the autopsy and when you made your finding at the conclusion of the autopsy that the cause and manner of Ms. Mullis's death was homicide?
So in between when the autopsy was complete and when I said it was homicide, to
That's
be
right.
clear? I did not. Is there an example of what I could have done? I finished the autopsy and I said it was homicide.
And you asked about examples. That is what I want to ask you about. I mean, given that you are open to, well, I want to get to the issue that you just raised, but I want to go back to one thing for just a moment. Do law enforcement officers come to every autopsy that you perform as a forensic pathologist?
No.
Did you draw any significance from the fact that Deputy Hemosath was at this one?
No.
How long of a drive is it from where Deputy Hemosath worked as a law enforcement officer to where you did this autopsy?
I don't know.
Was it your understanding that Deputy Hemosath was a law enforcement officer in the community that we're in today?
Yes.
How long of a drive is it from here to where you did this autopsy?
I believe it's about 3 hours.
Is it your testimony that you drew no conclusions from the fact that Deputy Hemosath drove 3 hours to be at this autopsy with you?
No, we have many people visit. Some just come for educational purposes. I encourage it. I think it's important for people who deal with death understand what an autopsy is like.
When you talked with Dr. Hemosath or Deputy Hemosath at this autopsy, Dr. Kruse, did he tell you that he was there for educational purposes?
Not that I recall.
I mean, did he tell you he was there to investigate Ms. Mullis' death?
He did.
It was not your understanding at the time of this autopsy he was there to educate himself about your process?
Well, he may have expressed it, and I didn't remember. I'm just saying people drive a long ways to see an autopsy pretty regularly.
Had you ever had Deputy Hemosath at an autopsy with you before this one?
Not that I recall.
During this autopsy, did Deputy Hemosath tell you his understanding of how Ms. Mullis had been found in terms of the position that she was found with the corn rake in her that led to her getting medical treatment in this case?
Yes.
What did he tell you during the autopsy about that issue, the position of the rake in her body?
I was told that she was essentially face down and the rake was sticking out of her back. I believe at that time, and I've been told subsequently, that 2 tines were said to have been inside her body and 2 tines were outside of her body when she was found.
During the autopsy, did Deputy Hemosath tell you that Ms. Mullis had been found with the corn rake in her back with the handle of the corn rake facing toward her head?
That does sound familiar. I'd have to go back and look. That's how I envision it when I think back.
And to make sure we're talking about the same thing, we understand that she wasn't found in a sitting up position, but I'm not going to get down on the ground for this purpose. But understanding that sitting here today, I'm not in the position that Deputy Hemosath said she'd been found in. Where would the handle of the corn rake have been relative to my body from your understanding of what Deputy Hemosath was describing?
The way you had just described it, I would envision the rake handle poking up toward the head.
Am I correct that given what Deputy Hemosath was describing to you, he was describing the corn rake handle extending from her back up over her head?
Yes.
And we agree that she wasn't in an upright position, but just to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Yes.
We're talking about the corn rake coming up this way, correct?
Yes.
All right. As you sit here, well, let me ask you this. At the time of your deposition in 2023, was that your understanding of how she had been found?
Yes.
Was that your understanding at the time of your autopsy?
Yes.
As of the time of your deposition in 2023, had anyone ever told you that that was not how she was found?
Not that I recall.
Did you base your opinions in this case on an understanding that at the time that Ms. Mullis was found, the handle of the corn rake was extending up over her head?
No.
And when you say no, can you explain to me what you mean by that?
How someone said they found the rake, the position of the handle, the position of her body, the rake was removed from her body. If I saw the corn rake like that, then maybe I could take it into consideration, but a simple description such as that had no bearing on my determination and was unnecessary to make the determination of homicide.
Why was it unnecessary for your ability to determine whether this was a homicide to try to determine what position the rake was in at the time Ms. Mullis was found?
Ms. Mullis was impaled with the corn rake, and how the corn rake ended up in her doesn't really change the fact that it's homicide.
And I want to make sure that I want to make sure I've asked my question in a clear way. And I'm going to ask with the court's permission, because I don't remember exactly how I worded it, is it possible for the court reporter to read the question back, Your Honor?
It is.
Thank you.
Why was it unnecessary for your ability to determine whether this was a homicide, to try to determine what position the rake was in at the time Ms. Mullis was found?
Was that your understanding of my question when you gave the answer you just gave?
Yes.
Am I correct that it was not important to you to understand the position that the corn rake was in at the time Ms. Mullis was found?
I would need more information to consider it, such as what injuries were associated with that corn rake in the position in which it were found, if you follow.
Well, at the time of your autopsy, what you were doing was looking at her injuries and trying to understand what those injuries were. Is that correct?
Well, I could tell what her injuries were.
Was the purpose of your autopsy to assess what her injuries were?
Yes.
And so when you say that you would need more information, would it have assisted your analysis of whether or not Ms. Mullis, the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, to understand the position that the rake was in relative to her body when she was found with the rake in her?
No.
We've been talking about your conversation with Deputy Hemaseth at the time of the autopsy. And during your conversation with Deputy Hemaseth during the autopsy, did you discuss with him the possibility of Ms. Mullis's injuries being the result of a fall?
We did discuss how they were not the result of a fall.
Well, during the autopsy itself, before you had finished the autopsy, did you tell Deputy Hemaseth that it was your opinion that the injuries that you observed during the autopsy were not the result of a fall?
I told him definitively at the end, and he had asked, and we discussed that they were allegedly from a fall, and he asked me, could they be from a fall? And I said no.
Was it your opinion that these injuries weren't from a fall even before you finished looking at Ms. Mullis's body?
It was determined at the end of the autopsy. Much of the examination is that external examination that begins the entire process. So I had a pretty clear idea before the internal examination began, and did not issue a final opinion until the end. But I was certain at the beginning that it was a homicide, and everything else within my autopsy supported that. I remained open throughout and found no evidence to the contrary.
Did you determine that Ms. Mullis's injuries were a homicide before you did your internal examination of her body?
Homicide was the manner of choice at that time. However, as I said, I remained open and found no evidence to the contrary.
while you were conducting the autopsy with Deputy Hemasath present, did he ask you if he could bring the corn rake into the autopsy to assist in an analysis of this case?
He asked if he could bring the corn rake closer to Miss Mullis on her clothing items. I said I preferred to keep them separate. The corn rake itself was within the autopsy suite, which is rather large for the purpose of photographing it. The corn rake did not come in contact with Miss Mullis during the autopsy.
During the autopsy, did you photograph the corn rake?
Yes.
During the autopsy, did you compare the corn rake directly with the injuries on Miss Mullis's body?
I examined each separately. As I had said, I did not put them close together, but I examined them separately and within a very small time period.
How far apart were the tines on the corn rake?
I would have to check my notes. I don't quite remember.
Which notes would you like to check to answer that question?
I guess I would have to go back at the photographs because I did not put that in my actual written notes or in my autopsy report.
Was it important to your analysis to know how far apart the tines of the corn rake were?
It was information to consider. Like I said, there had been no information to suggest that anything other than the corn rake caused her injuries. There are some inherent difficulties in comparing a fixed object with the human body, which is malleable and can contort into different positions. So taking straight measurements from an object and comparing them directly with the body is fraught with issues. But measurements such as that are important just to have every bit of evidence possible.
Is there a reason, if it was important for you to have those measurements, that you didn't document them in your notes or your report?
They were documented with photographs, and I can't recall why I didn't simply write it down.
You talked about, during your autopsy, conducting both an internal examination and an external examination of Miss Mullis's body. And I want to ask you, just as to the external examination, you examined, well, during the autopsy, did you examine her face and her head?
Yes.
Did you examine the front of her chest?
Yes.
Did you examine her hands?
Yes.
Did you examine her knees?
Yes.
And I think you told us a minute ago that you did examine, you had the clothing that she'd been wearing accessible to you at the autopsy as well.
Yes.
What was your understanding of what clothing she'd been wearing that would have covered the top half of her body at the time that she experienced these injuries?
I know on the outer layer she was wearing a thick jacket, and I believe she had 2 additional layers of clothing on top.
At the time that you conducted the autopsy, did you look at Miss Mullis's clothing for any holes?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
The holes were actually quite obvious when we photographed them. It's within our standard procedure to photograph clothing as it is received, so I make note of everything I see.
How many holes did you see on Miss Mullis's coat at autopsy?
I saw multiple holes. I did not count them.
Were the holes in her clothing important information to help you determine what the cause and manner of her death were?
No.
Did you photograph her clothing during the autopsy with the holes that you'd observed in the clothing marked?
Yes.
Did you take, well, I'm actually going to show you, at this moment, Your Honor, I'm going to show the witness exhibit 524. Is that being displayed?
Yes.
She has it now, yes.
You've been shown, Dr. Kruse, what's been marked as Exhibit 524. Do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes.
What is it?
It's an autopsy photograph. This is of Miss Mullis's jacket. It has a ruler with our state medical examiner number on it and a number of arrows that point to defects in the clothing.
Does Exhibit 24 accurately reflect the holes that you saw in the jacket at autopsy?
It accurately reflects what I saw at autopsy, yes.
Well, did you or your assistant put 4 large arrows on the 4 holes that you saw in the jacket to document those holes in this photograph?
Yes, my assistant did.
Was this photograph the only documentation of the holes that you saw? Let me ask this question again. Was this photograph, Exhibit 524, the only documentation that you made of the holes in Miss Mullis's jacket at autopsy?
There are other photographs. I can't recall if they have arrows or not.
Is it your testimony that there are, well, let me ask you this. Are there any other photographs with arrows marking the holes that you observed at autopsy?
I just said I don't recall.
We were talking about your conversation with Deputy Hemesath for a minute, and I believe it was your testimony that it did not matter to you what position the rake was in at the time Miss Mullis was found in terms of the ultimate cause and manner of death determinations that you made about Miss Mullis's death. Is that right?
What someone says in terms of the position, yes. I mean, that's taking someone's description at face value. So no, I did not take it into consideration and did not need to.
Well, did the information about how the rake was found in her body help you to make it clear what caused the injuries?
The fact that a rake was found in her body was helpful, yes.
Did it help you to determine which injuries Miss Mullis experienced in what order?
No.
Did it help you to determine, well, is it your testimony today that the fact that the rake was in her body in a certain way was not important to your assessment of the cause and manner of her death?
The fact that someone says they found the rake in a certain position was not something I considered or needed to consider.
At the conclusion of your autopsy, did you feel confident that Miss Mullis's death was a homicide?
Yes.
If you had not been confident at that time that Miss Mullis's death was a homicide, what would have been the appropriate finding in your case?
I would have pended the case for further review, investigative materials, etc.
And you did not pen the case at the conclusion of the autopsy?
Officially, I did on paper, but verbally, no, I did not. It was determined to be a homicide.
Was the reason that you penned the case on paper because law enforcement asked you to do that so that they can continue an investigation?
I don't have a recollection of if I was asked to. It's something I would have offered to do. It's pretty standard in our practice. We will withhold cause and manner of death so law enforcement can continue with their investigation so it doesn't jeopardize their investigation.
At the conclusion of this autopsy, was whatever was on paper, in your heart, this was not a pending investigation in terms of the cause and manner of her death. Is that right?
Yeah, in my brain, it was not pending.
All right. You did have one, well, let me ask you this. Did you have the toxicology request that was still outstanding at the conclusion of the autopsy?
Yes.
What type of toxicology request did you make at the end of this autopsy?
I ordered what we call a basic panel. It looks at drugs of abuse and alcohol.
Does this basic panel look for prescription medications beyond drugs of abuse?
No.
For Ms. Mullis's autopsy, could you have submitted a request for a toxicology panel that covered prescription medications other than drugs of abuse?
Yes, I could have.
Is that something you did?
No, I did not.
You told me a minute ago that you were open to, that you, in your general practice, are open to other information about your cases other than what you see and observe at autopsy. Is that right?
Yes.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any context about where exactly her body had been found?
No.
Did you want any context at the time you determined this was a homicide about where on the Mullis property she had been found?
No.
Did you want any context at the time you determined this was a homicide about what the materials were, what the floor was made of in the area where she was found?
Out of all the information you provided, that would be the most interesting, because I do think she did sustain blunt force injuries that could be related to hitting the ground. So I think that information would be useful, yes. But it would not change my manner. I'm sorry.
At the conclusion of your autopsy, how did you know that it wouldn't change your opinion what surface she'd been found on if you didn't know what surface she was found on?
She was impaled in the back with a corn rake, so what she was standing on didn't really make a difference. But it's important to be able to understand all different sorts of wound patterns. And in addition to the injuries on her back that caused her death, she had some blunt force injuries.
Was it well, as to the blunt force injuries, at the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you know what had caused any of the injuries that you say were blunt force injuries on her body?
No blunt force. None of them had a pattern that could tell me definitively where they came from.
Is it true then that you did not need to understand what those blunt force injuries were in order to determine that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
I did not need them, no.
I mean, is it true that those blunt force injuries then were not relevant to deciding whether or not Ms. Mullis was the victim of a homicide?
They were supportive, but not absolutely necessary for that determination, no.
Dr. Kruse, how could they be supportive if you didn't even know what caused them?
They were supportive, as I had said earlier. She sustained a number of puncture wounds to her back, suggested to be from a fall, which would make the manner of death an accident, which is seemingly the only other option than homicide. If someone falls backwards, they don't get injuries to the front of them, so that supported that she was impaled with the corn rake and did not fall backwards on it.
Is that the only reason in your mind that determining what caused the blunt force injuries wouldn't be relevant to your determination about whether or not this was a homicide?
I think relevant is misleading. It's important to document everything you see and not be dismissive of it. So I take my findings and I do my best to interpret them appropriately. Seeing an injury and then getting additional information as to what could have caused it is always helpful and important for every pathologist to take that into consideration. I did not need them to determine that her cause of death was due to the sharp force injuries of her back. Her death was not due to blunt force injuries.
Was it possible in your mind at the time that you completed Ms. Mullis's autopsy that there could be an explanation for every single one of the blunt force injuries that you observed on her body that would explain that those injuries were caused by her everyday life or an accidental source or something that did not have to do with her being struck by, in your mind, struck by a corn rake?
Are you saying there are explanations like that for them?
I'm asking you, did you consider that possibility at the time you determined this was a homicide?
blunt force injuries are difficult to interpret, so it's always important to consider that they could have come earlier in the day and may not have been associated with the injuries that caused someone's death. The sheer number of Ms. Mullis's injuries and the nature of them is highly suggestive that at least most of them are associated with her death.
Is that because of, in your mind, the number of other things you observed?
I've performed many autopsies, and the number of her injuries was substantial. And I do not think they were incurred during the course of her everyday life.
Well, at the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you take any steps to learn what the cause of any of the other, what you say were blunt force injuries on her body were?
As I stated, blunt force injuries can be difficult. None of them had a clear pattern to them. So you could take steps to postulate as to how they happened, but there's no way to know for sure. And to say you know exactly for sure how they happened is incorrect.
And Dr. Kruse, isn't it true you were taking steps to postulate how they happened by postulating that in your mind, because of the number of them, they must have been associated with her death?
I'm not saying exactly how they occurred, which is what you asked me.
But it was your testimony that because of the number of them, it was unlikely that they were injuries that occurred in the course of her everyday life. Wasn't that your testimony?
Yes.
So you were postulating that based on the number of them, even though you didn't know what they were caused by, they were related to her death?
That they were most likely related to her death, at least most of them.
So isn't it true that you were postulating what those injuries were without really having any understanding of why they were there?
I do not know exactly what caused them. However, in my expertise, my medical opinion, those are not due to everyday life. And that's an important determination we need to make as forensic pathologists, because we often get cases, more often than not, when there's concern because someone has a number of injuries, then law enforcement may think that their death may be due to an injury. And we then determine if those injuries could be due to normal, everyday life. That's something that's standard to my practice, and I feel very comfortable doing that.
Did you have any way to distinguish at the time of Ms. Mullis's autopsy whether what you say were blunt force injuries on her body were injuries that she experienced in a fall versus from some other source?
Like I said, you can't say exactly what it is. It could be from a fall, absolutely. Striking objects while falling, striking the ground, absolutely.
And if the blunt force injuries that you say you observed on her body during the autopsy are consistent with a fall, then how could any of those injuries be supportive of the idea that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
The blunt force injuries are on the opposite side of her body to the other injuries. So either she fell forward or backward. You can pick one.
Is it true that at the time of Ms. Mullis's autopsy, that because you could not envision a circumstance in which Ms. Mullis sustained these injuries other than someone impaling her with the corn rake, that is the reason you determined that this was a homicide?
There is no other way. Yes.
And that's your opinion based on the autopsy that you conducted and your conversations with Deputy Homicide?
I'm not sure how my conversations with him helped me come to that conclusion. Without speaking to him, I would have come to that same conclusion at autopsy.
That would have been your conclusion based solely on what you observed at autopsy?
Yes.
And that's because you did not take any steps to learn any context about, for instance, what the surface of the floor was in the area where she was found?
I was able to make that determination without that information at that time, yes.
And you didn't seek that information out?
No, not at that time, no.
Did you need to know at the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide whether she had been found with her face resting on a surface for some period of time?
I was aware that her face was on the ground, and I am aware you have someone saying that her face was resting on the floor for such a period of time. She sustained a very large abraded contusion on her jaw. I don't think that's an appropriate explanation of that injury, especially given that she has additional injuries to the left side of her head, such as bruising to her left ear, bruising behind her left ear. But if that's what another forensic pathologist wants to say, then still doesn't change my opinion.
Well, Dr. Kruse, that wasn't my question, was it? I mean, my question was whether at the time you determined that her death was a homicide, whether you had information at that point about whether her face had been resting on a surface.
I don't recall. I know that I was told that she was prone, so face down, so her face could have been resting. It's a possibility.
At the time you made your determinations, did you take any steps to learn that?
Where her face was?
Yes.
Not that I recall.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you know where she had been injured?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. At the time that you determined Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you know where it was that she had been injured?
The
Meaning,
location?
not the location on her body, but the location in the world.
Yeah, I'm very body focused, if you haven't noticed. I was told she was injured on a farm in a shed.
Well, you were deposed in this case, isn't that right?
I was deposed twice.
You were deposed in this case in 2023?
Yes.
And isn't it... Do you recall being deposed in this case?
Yes.
Did you testify at your deposition in 2023 that you did not know where it was that she had experienced these injuries?
Correct.
So at the time you determined that her death was a homicide, you did not know where it was that she'd been injured?
No, I was told where she was found, and all that's just information from other people. I have absolutely no idea where she was injured.
At the conclusion of your autopsy in this case, did you certify the death certificate for Ms. Mullis?
I waited. That's that pending cause and manner. I eventually did certify it.
And I understand. I was not intending to imply that you did that immediately, but at some point after you completed the autopsy, did you certify the death certificate for Ms. Mullis?
Yes.
What does it mean to certify someone's death certificate?
A death certificate is a document that has a number of bits of information about a person. The part that I'm responsible for as the medical certifier include the cause of death, the manner of death, how injury occurred, and some other little bits of information. So to certify the death certificate means to place that information into an electronic record, and then I electronically sign it.
By certifying a death certificate, are you certifying that the information on the death certificate is accurate?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 354. Your Honor, we're going to show the witness what's been marked as Exhibit 354, and I'll just make a record that there is some personal identifying information on this record which we've redacted. But otherwise, this is a true and accurate copy of Exhibit 354.
Okay, the record will reflect that.
Are you seeing Exhibit 354?
Yes.
What is Exhibit 354?
This is Amy Lynn Mullis's death certificate.
Do you see that her birth date and her social security number are redacted?
I do see that, yes.
Other than those redactions, is Exhibit 354 a true and accurate copy of the death certificate that you certified as to Ms. Mullis's death?
That portion that I described that I certify, I can say yes. The decedent information portion is the responsibility of the funeral home, so I'm not necessarily comfortable saying that's true. I don't know where she lived.
Other than the decedent information section, did you complete the remainder of this death certificate?
Most of it, yes. Not that funeral home portion at the bottom, but really that central area.
Understood. Did you complete the portion of this death certificate that provides a medical cause of death?
Yes.
And what did you certify as the medical cause of death for Ms. Mullis?
Sharp force injuries of torso.
Is it your opinion in this case that the injuries that Ms. Mullis had on her torso were sharp force injuries?
Yes.
And does this death certificate provide a space to explain what the injuries that you identify as the cause of death are due to or as a consequence of?
Yes, that's what it said. In this case, there really wouldn't be anything appropriate to put underneath that.
And why is that?
So sharp force injuries of torso are essentially, well, there are two components of the cause of death on a death certificate. There's the immediate cause of death, whatever condition, injury that ultimately led someone to die right away. That can be due to something else, which is called the underlying cause of death. That immediate cause of death sometimes can be so specific it really doesn't belong on the death certificate, because ultimately a death certificate is for vital statistics purposes, tracking diseases, injury trends. So that underlying cause of death is really the most important, which is what I put. So the sharp force injuries of torso is that underlying cause of death. If you wanted to put something above it into immediate cause of death, like pneumothorax, something along those lines, you could. But in my opinion, in this case, the sharp force injuries of torso is perfectly sufficient for cause of death.
And did you identify in this certificate the immediate cause of death as you just described?
I did not, and in this case, with an injury that happens quickly like this, one could argue you're getting into mechanism of death territory, which we are instructed not to do by the CDC. So to me, her death was sharp force injuries of torso.
Did you include on this death certificate what the place of her injury was?
Yes.
And what did you say on Ms. Mullis's death certificate the place of her injury was?
Farm building.
Isn't it true that at the time, that by your testimony, at the time you determined the cause and manner of her death, you did not know in your mind where she'd been injured?
Yes.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any context about what Ms. Mullis had been doing earlier that day?
Want is an interesting word. I do like having information about the circumstances surrounding the death, so sure, I would want more information such as that.
At the time you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have any information about what Ms. Mullis had been doing earlier in the day that she was injured?
I believe I did. I believe she was working on the farm in some capacity.
Where did you get information about her working on the farm at the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
That would be from law enforcement.
Isn't it true that that's not information you learned until after you had determined that this was a homicide?
I suppose I can't recall clearly. We received a lot of information in a short period of time, so it's definitely possible I learned it after, but it's a pretty simple bit of information. I don't think it would take too much digging to get that.
Well, in this case, Dr. Kruse, did you receive a lot of information in a short period of time before you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide?
I guess it's your opinion is that a lot of information. I had information about the circumstances surrounding her death. I didn't have finalized law enforcement reports, and as we established, I can't recall if I had her medical records or not. So I didn't have what one would consider a ton of information, but I didn't need it.
The only information you had at the time you determined this was a homicide was information that you saw at autopsy and that you got from talking with Deputy Hemosath and with Dr. Thompson, correct?
As far as I recall, yes.
And that was not a lot of information.
I suppose that's your opinion.
Well, I'm asking if, in your opinion, was it a lot of information?
The judge is going to ask an answer, and she's also being argumentative at this point.
Sustained.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any information about the prescription medications that Ms. Mullis was taking?
No, but I had it. Oh, I'm sorry, after the autopsy, I did get that information.
And to be clear, I'm asking about at the time you determined this was a homicide. At that time, you did not know anything about prescription medications that she was taking.
Not that I recall, no.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want any information about what emergency responders had observed when they provided her with medical aid?
I do want information about what emergency responders saw, and very much so about what they do, or what they did as part of their resuscitative efforts.
You testified a moment ago about being concerned in your testimony today about injuries that were on the front of Ms. Mullis's body. You know now that Ms. Mullis had resuscitative efforts on her way to the hospital, is that right?
Yes.
Did those resuscitative efforts include her receiving CPR?
Yes.
And did those resuscitative efforts include the use of something called a Lucas device?
Yes.
Can CPR and the use of a Lucas device bruise someone's chest?
Yes.
Is it common for those actions to bruise someone's chest?
Bruise or abrade the chest, yes.
And so the blunt force, any blunt force injuries that you observed on Ms. Mullis's chest that were in the area where CPR is performed, are those injuries that you would expect to be associated with CPR?
It can be difficult if someone has injuries to begin with and CPR is performed in that same area, but I think it's reasonable to say that at least some of the injuries could be from CPR.
Well, in this particular case, would you as a forensic pathologist assume that injuries in that area would be connected with CPR?
I think it's most likely, and I did so. She had a sternal fracture that I determined to be related to CPR.
And you mentioned this a moment ago. At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have any of her medical records from Regional Medical Center?
I do not recall.
Do you remember what day of the week you did Ms. Mullis's autopsy?
Yes.
What day of the week was it?
Monday.
And what day of the week was Ms. Mullis brought into Regional Medical Center?
It was a Saturday.
Isn't it true that you did not get Ms. Mullis's medical records until after you conducted the autopsy in this case?
I think that's the most likely scenario.
At the time you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, had you talked with any biomechanical expert?
No.
At the time that you determined Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, had you talked with any incident reconstruction expert?
No.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have an understanding of the angle of the wound paths on Ms. Mullis's torso?
Yes, I determined, well, the direction of the wound paths within the body. I did not have a specific angle.
At the time you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want to figure out the specific angle of the wound paths?
No.
At the time that you determined that Ms. Mullis's death was a homicide, did you have in your mind of exactly how the corn rake entered her body?
She was impaled with it by another person.
And I understand that your opinion is that she was impaled by another person, but at the time you determined this was a homicide, did you have any understanding of how she was impaled?
Could you be more specific?
Sure. Did you have an understanding of whether the corn rake was swung into her body?
I did not, no.
Did you have an understanding of whether the corn rake was pushed into her body?
No.
Did you have any understanding of whether the corn rake entered her body in some other way by a person, in your opinion, causing it to enter her body?
It could have been swung, pushed, kicked. Someone else impaled her in the back with the corn rake multiple times.
Was it important to you at the time you determined this was a homicide to try to determine which of those routes this was?
That's not something I could do.
At the time you determined this was a homicide, did you want to understand why there had been blood found on Miss Mullis's hand?
Did I? No.
At the time you determined this was a homicide, did you want to figure out why there was blood on the handle of the corn rake?
Want, again, is a hard word. I was aware that there was blood on the rake. I was told that she was found with a rake in her. To me, it supports the implement that caused her injuries. So I already knew all that at autopsy.
At the time that you determined Miss Mullis's death was a homicide, did you want to understand if there was some connection between the blood on the rake and the blood on her hand?
The blood on her hand has so many potential sources. As you yourself indicated, she received CPR and pretty lengthy CPR. I just don't know the nature of that blood, so to try and connect those two would be inappropriate in my opinion.
Did you take any steps to learn the nature of that blood?
As I said, given all the events that followed Ms. Mullis being found, I don't think anyone